On the 24th of July, Rugby Sevens will return to the Olympics for the third consecutive Olympiad. But rugby in the Olympics goes back much further than when it arrived in Rio in 2016, with it first appearing at the Olympics over 100 years ago and even influencing games that it wasn't involved in. So from its exclusion in the early 1920s to instigating an Olympic boycott in the 70s, let's take a look at rugby's influence on the Olympic Games. Rugby didn't appear at the first Olympics in 1896, but would make its first appearance at the second Olympiad in 1900 at the Paris Olympic Games. Only 3 nations partook in the rugby event: France, Germany and Great Britain, where France beat Germany and then Great Britain to be awarded the gold medal, while Germany and Great Britain didn't play and shared the silver. The gold medal match was the highest attended event at the Olympics, being played in front of 6,000 spectators. The France medal went down as mixed team, which was a designation given to teams that had players in it not from the country they represented. France had Constantine Henriquez and André Roosevelt, who were Haitian and American respectively. The International Olympic Committee, or IOC, now groups mixed team results together. Rugby's next appearance at the Olympics wouldn't be until 8 years later at the 1908 Games in London. Only 2 teams took part that year: Australasia and Great Britain. In the 1908 Olympics, Australia and New Zealand competed together as Australasia, but the rugby team consisted only of Australian internationals, as they had just finished a tour of the UK where they only lost 1 of their 31 matches. Even though only 3 teams played, 8 unions were invited. Wales, Scotland and Ireland ignored the RFU's approach for Team Great Britain, but New Zealand and South Africa rejected the invitations, and even though France originally agreed to compete, they later withdrew. Great Britain were represented entirely by Cornwall, the 1908 English county champions. The game was played at the White City Stadium in London and was on a field right next to the Olympic swimming pool. They had to line the pitch with mattresses to prevent injury, and kicks to touch would often end up with the ball going into the Olympic swimming pool. Australasia would prove to be too much for Great Britain and won 32-3. The silver medal was drawn by the GB players and was won by Thomas Wedge, and the medal now sits on display at St Ives RFC. 100 years later, the British Olympic Association has celebrated the game in a centenary celebration match between Australia and the Barbarians in 2008. Instead of the Babas wearing their club socks, as is tradition, they wore black and gold socks to represent Cornwall. Rugby was not selected for the 1912 Games, nor the 1916 Games, which was cancelled due to the outbreak of World War I. But in the 1920 Games in Antwerp, it would return with a surprising victor. 4 teams entered into the 1920 Olympics: France, USA, Czechoslovakia and Romania. Great Britain refused entry as they had to play as a combined team and not as their separate unions. When they refused to play, all other nations from the British Empire also refused. Interestingly, the USA squad was made up entirely of Californians, which was the only place in the US that rugby had any sort of foothold due to American football being banned at many Californian universities between 1906 and 1914. But by the time the games happened, this ended and the team was mainly made up of college football players. The players had to convince the US Olympic Committee to enter a rugby team, and even though they did, they were so uninterested in the event that they made the players pay their own way to the games. The team held fundraiser events such as baseball games and dances, gained sponsorship from wealthy benefactors, and grants were sought after from cities such as Santa Clara and San Francisco. And on the 28th of July 1920, the US team left from Berkeley, California on the long 5,500-mile journey to Antwerp. By the time they had arrived, Czechoslovakia and Romania had dropped out of the games, leaving them with only 1 match to play against France and guaranteeing them a medal no matter the outcome. Due to the inexperience of the US team and the long travel, everyone thought France would walk the game, but the Americans would prove to be tougher opposition than anyone had expected, and went on to win the gold in an 8-0 victory over the French. After the shock victory, the USA stayed in Europe and won games in Lyon, Toulouse and Bordeaux against regionally combined teams, proving that the Olympics was no fluke, before coming to Paris to play France again. But alas, they lost 14-5. The USA's Maurice Kirksey won another gold in that year's Olympics in the 4x100 meter relay. The USA may have won gold in 1920, but it changed nothing to stop the decline of rugby in the USA. However, the US Olympic Committee agreed to allow the USA to enter a team in the 1924 Paris Olympics and defend their title after France issued a challenge in 1923. France and the USA would be joined by Romania, with nobody nobody else entering due to travel, and Great Britain refusing as the games clashed with domestic fixtures. Even though the USA were previous gold medal winners, the team that travelled to the 1924 Olympics was even less experienced in rugby than the team that won in 1920. So they decided to get some experience by touring the UK before the Olympics started, and began their 6,000-kilometre journey to Paris via England. They were the target of hostility before even reaching France. Immigration officers in Boulogne refused them entry to the country and were not allowed to leave the boat, which took over 6 hours to solve, by the US team allegedly forming a rugby-style scrum to take on immigration officials blocking their way. I'm not sure I believe in that, to be honest, but regardless, the French press branded them as street fighters and saloon brawlers. France were standout favourites for the gold medal, beating Romania pretty comfortably in the opening game, 59-3. After this defeat, even the Americans didn't believe they had a chance, with the captain Babe Slater writing in his diary, "I frankly believe our chances of beating them are slim, although we are sure going to let them know they've been in a battle." There was a dispute between the USA's management and the French team around who would referee the final match against France, even though Slater had already agreed to the arrangement. This resulted in the French removing access to practice pitches for the USA team, who now had to train in a local park. The Americans eventually broke into the practice field in disregard of their ban, which ended up leading to their clothes being stolen during a practice session, resulting in hundreds of lost dollars and possessions. After getting wind of the break-in, the French press went after the US team by claiming they weren't proper amateurs and publishing an article by a Paris councillor criticising the US team. In response to this, the Americans invited the Frenchmen to come down to the pitch to discuss matters. Is it just me who thinks there's certain undertones to that? Trouble off the pitch persisted with the US national team, as arguments around the US team filming their match against Romania erupted, as sole rights had been given to a French company, which caused the US to threaten to pull out of the games, and their request was eventually granted. But due to the French press's anti-American rhetoric, the team were now being cursed and spat on in the streets of Paris, and one paper strangely even tried to claim the USA didn't win the 1920 Olympics rugby event. During the USA-Romania game, the French crowd hissed and booed the US team throughout the game, and wildly cheered for Romania when they had the ball. The French press started criticising the crowd for how harsh they had been, which is pretty typical of the press to create animosity and then criticise the people for partaking in it. Despite the reaction of the crowd though, the USA won the match 37-0 and now had a game against France to try and retain their gold medal. They resolved the issue with the referee with the appointment of Welshman Albert Freethy, and the game went ahead as scheduled. 50,000 French fans continued to boo and hiss the Americans throughout the game, which was rough and violent, with a couple of French players getting injured and there being accusations of punching and kicking in the scrum. Due to many of the Americans being American football players, they tackled differently to what the French players were used to. Even though it was legal, it was much rougher than what was expected in Europe. This riled the French crowd even more, and American fans started being attacked in the crowd and bottles and rocks were thrown onto the pitch. But the US team would have the last laugh and win the game 17-3, but the French fans weren't done yet. They invaded the field, leading to the US players needing police protection from the fans, and when the medals were finally able to be awarded, the crowd drowned out Star Spangled Banner as the US team retained their gold medal. After the 1924 Olympics, Pierre de Coubertin, founder of the modern Olympics, would step down as the IOC president, and his successor was no fan of rugby. You see, Pierre de Coubertin was a massive fan of rugby. During his younger years, he travelled to the UK and took great interest in the public school system. He knew of rugby school's headmaster, Tom Arnold, through his writing, and had also read Tom Brown's School Days, which is set at rugby school. He took a massive fascination with football, and more specifically, rugby football, and how sport was at the centre of many of England's public schools. When he returned to France, he set up rugby teams in multiple schools in Paris, and helped set up the Union of French Athletic Sport Societies in 1890, which at the time oversaw the governing of many sports such as athletics, cycling, fencing, hockey, croquet and swimming, but most importantly, football and rugby. He was so widely regarded in the eyes of French rugby that he even refereed the 1892 match between Stade Francais and Racing Club de France, which is now regarded as the first French championship final. But his successor, Henri de Bellay-Latour, was eager to get rugby out of the Olympics. In an effort to increase the number of individuals individual and women's events, they started removing team sports from the Olympics. And along with the violence that had occurred off the pitch during the 1924 final and the lack of participation from nations, rugby was in the firing lines and was removed from the Olympics, even though it was the most attended event at the 1924 Olympic Games. And that 1924 match between France and the USA would be the last memory of rugby at the Olympics for 92 years. Or would it? An attempt to add sevens as an exhibition sport in 1932 was made by a Scotsman, but it was rejected due to American football and lacrosse having already been chosen as two exhibition events. And in 1936, a pre-Olympic tournament was held involving France, Germany, Italy and Romania, which is the predecessor to the current Rugby Europe Championship. There were other attempts at re-inclusion, in Italy in 1960, the Soviet Union in 1980, and in South Korea in 1988, but none of those would be successful. But in 1976, rugby would have a massive impact on the Olympics, even though it wouldn't be a participating sport. On the 30th of June of that year, the All Blacks would take to the field to play Border RFC in East London, South Africa. This would be the start of one of the most controversial tours in sports history, due to the South African National Olympic Committee being banned from the IOC since 1970 due to their racial segregation in sport. Many nations were not happy with New Zealand's choice to tour South Africa. African countries demanded that New Zealand be excluded from the 1976 Olympics, but the IOC refused as rugby was not an Olympic sport. This led to 28 countries boycotting that year's Olympics, and to the Gleneagles Agreement in 1977, which saw all Commonwealth nations agree to not play South Africa in any sporting manner. By the 1990s, the IRB started making attempts to join the IOC, and in 1994, the late Vernon Pugh was elected as IRB chairman. He convinced the IRB Council that they should join the IOC as a non-participating sport, as he believed that it would be beneficial to the rugby unions and allow them to join the National Olympic Committees. As more nations from Asia, Oceania and the Americas joined the IRB, the support towards becoming a participating member in the Olympics grew, as these nations saw it as a realistic chance to win medals. And in November of 1994, the IRB was confirmed as a recognised international federation of the IOC. It was stated during the induction ceremony that rugby's history and values were in line with that of the Olympics. But the IRB weren't the only people trying to get rugby into the Olympics at the same time. World Wheelchair Rugby, or the WWR, were focused on attaining participation in the Paralympics, and in 1996 they were invited as a demonstration sport, before becoming a full participating event in 2000. Wheelchair rugby is a mentally brutal sport and lives up to its nickname of murder ball. 4 different teams have won gold for this event: the USA, New Zealand, Australia and most recently Great Britain. Canada have won silver 3 times, while Japan won bronze in 2016 and 2020. Wheelchair rugby is set to continue at the 2024 Paralympic Games. But back to the IRB, who put rugby forward to be entered into the Olympics in 2005 at the 117th IOC session meeting, along with golf, karate, roller sport and squash, to be added for the 2012 Olympics. However, squash and karate were chosen over rugby, but in the end, no new events were added for the 2012 Olympic Games. Rugby would later once again be in consideration to be added, but this time in its sevens format. ILC members attended the Sevens World Cup in 2009 after being invited by the IRB. The event had 78,000 attendees over the 3 days, with Wales winning the men's title and Australia the women's. Jonah Lomu, Lawrence Delali and Waiseli Servi were later all announced as ambassadors of the bid, and the IRB even went as far as to offer to drop the Sevens World Cup to ensure the Olympics would be the premier event of the Sevens calendar. They decided in the end not to drop it, and in October of 2009 the IOC voted to include Rugby Sevens in the 2016 Olympic Games. Sevens was chosen over 15s as its truncated format of 14-minute games, with full events being taken over 2 days, was seen as more suitable for a multi-sport event compared to 15s. For example, the Sevens World Cup in 2022 took 3 days, while the 15s World Cup in 2023 took 6 weeks. The format for the Olympics has 12 participating nations for both men and women. These teams are selected as the host nation, 4 from the World Series, 6 by finishing first in their continental championships, and the last place from an intercontinental championship. These teams are split into 3 pools of 4, playing the other teams in their pool once, with the top 2 from each pool and the best 3rd place teams progressing to the quarterfinals. There is then a semi-final, a bronze final and a final, with the winner of the final gaining gold and so on. There's also a consolidation semi and final round for the teams knocked out in the quarterfinal. In the 2016 games, the USA were once again involved in Olympic rugby, trying to retain their medal. However, However, they would go on to finish 9th in the men's bracket. The first ever women's rugby final at the Olympics would see Australia come away as victors, beating arch rivals New Zealand 24-17. In the men's bracket, further history would happen. Fiji, who had been one of the more dominant sides in the Sevens series, would come away with their first ever Olympic medal by beating Great Britain in the final 43-7. For the following Olympics, that was played in 2021, due to the pandemic, the format stayed the same as the previous games, with Fiji retaining their gold medal by beating New Zealand in the final of the men's bracket, but the women would avenge their brothers by beating Fiji in the semi-final before going on to beat France 26-12 in the final. Fiji, however, won bronze by beating Great Britain in the bronze final. In the aftermath of the 2020 Olympics, changes were made to the Sevens World Series for it to fall more in line with Olympic competition. One of the main changes saw the disbandment of Scotland, England and Wales within the Sevens series and the creation of a Great Britain Sevens team. This angered many, particularly in Scotland, as the town of Melrose in the Scottish borders is where Sevens was born. Many Scotland Sevens fans saw this as a sign of utter disrespect to the nation that invented the game and choose to not support the GB team in the Sevens series. Great Britain's men's team failed to qualify for the 2024 Olympic Games. So that's us all caught up with the modern Olympics. But the Olympics existed long before its revival in 1896 and goes back to antiquity in ancient Greece in the 7th century BC. But rugby didn't exist back then, did it? Well, in ancient Greece they had a sport called episkrios, and the Romans had their own version called harpastum. Because of course they did. These sports were very similar to rugby in that they were ball games that consisted of similar numbers of players, normally around 12 to 14, and even had things called scrums. However, neither of these were ever played at the ancient Olympic Games in Greece, but I just thought it was an interesting thing to mention. But isn't it funny that a nation that isn't known for its rugby prowess in the USA could legitimately claim to be the best team in the world for 67 years, right up until New Zealand won the first Rugby World Cup in 1987. A tournament you can also learn the entire history of by watching this video right here. Thanks for watching.